The doctors had already done everything they could, and the room no longer carried the urgency of a fight, but the quiet weight of an ending. The kind of silence that settles only when no one expects an answer anymore, when the machines continue their work out of habit rather than hope, and the people standing there understand without a single word being spoken that this moment has crossed a line from effort into waiting. The monitors still glowed softly in the dimmed room, tracing steady lines that meant very little now, while one doctor stepped back from the bed and slowly removed his gloves. Not in frustration, not in anger, but with the calm acceptance of someone who knows there is nothing left to add, nothing left to adjust, nothing left to try. A nurse lowered her eyes. Another turned slightly toward the wall. No one said it aloud, but everyone in that room felt the same thought pass through them, heavy and unmistakable. This was the end. And yet, in the stillness that followed, something shifted. The room felt suspended in time, as if the night itself had decided to pause there, holding its breath along with everyone else, while the patient lay unmoving beneath thin hospital sheets, surrounded by wires, tubes, and machines that continued their quiet vigilance even as human certainty faded. Earlier, there had been urgency voices overlapping, footsteps quick and purposeful, decisions made in seconds. But now that urgency had dissolved into something far heavier, a silence filled not with peace, but with the weight of finality, the kind that presses gently yet relentlessly against the chest. A man stood near the foot of the bed, his hands clasped so tightly that he no longer felt the strain in his fingers, staring at the patient without blinking, as if looking away might somehow seal what he was not ready to accept. While beside him, a woman sat rigid in a chair, her back straight, her gaze fixed on nothing in particular. Her tears spent hours earlier, leaving only a quiet exhaustion behind. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. The machines continued their soft, mechanical rhythm, indifferent to fear, grief, or hope, offering numbers and sounds that once meant possibility, but now felt distant, almost symbolic, like echoes of something that had already passed. In that moment, the room was filled with waiting, not the kind that expects a result, but the kind that exists when outcomes are no longer being negotiated, when time stretches not because something is about to happen, but because nothing is supposed to. And yet, beneath that stillness, unseen and unnoticed, something was already beginning to change. The night had not begun with panic, nor with any sense that life was about to fracture so abruptly, because just hours earlier, everything had still belonged to the ordinary rhythm of existence, the quiet routines that never announce their importance until they are suddenly interrupted by something irreversible. The patient had been at home when it happened, in a space that was familiar and safe, surrounded by the unnoticed details of everyday life, when the body failed without warning, collapsing into a crisis so sudden that there was no time to prepare emotionally, no space to ease into fear, only the sharp transition from normality to emergency. An ambulance arrived quickly, lights cutting through the darkness as neighbors watched from a distance, confused and silent, while trained hands moved with precision, lifting, stabilizing, speaking in clipped sentences that carried urgency without emotion, because that is what they are taught to do when seconds matter more than comfort. At the hospital, everything moved fast at first, as it always does in the beginning, with doors opening, gurneys rolling, voices exchanging information in a language shaped by years of training, while family members followed behind, powerless and breathless, already sensing that they were crossing into a world where control would no longer belong to them. Tests were ordered, scans reviewed, specialists called in, each step narrowing the possibilities rather than expanding them, until the situation began to reveal its gravity, not through dramatic declarations, but through subtle changes in tone, longer pauses between sentences, and the way doctors stopped offering reassurance and began offering honesty instead. This was a modern hospital, equipped with advanced technology and experienced professionals, a place where countless lives had been saved through skill, knowledge, and persistence. Yet even here, limits existed quiet, invisible boundaries beyond which medicine could not easily pass. As the hours unfolded, hope did not vanish suddenly, but thinned gradually, worn down by complication after complication, until what remained was no longer optimism but endurance, the fragile determination to stay present even when the outcome was no longer clear. By the time the night deepened and exhaustion settled into every corner of the waiting room, the family understood, without needing to be told directly, that this was no longer a situation defined by probability or statistics, but by something far more uncertain, something that could not be measured or predicted. And still they waited. There comes a moment in certain rooms where effort quietly steps aside, not because it was insufficient, but because it has reached the furthest point it knows how to reach. And that moment arrived without ceremony, without raised voices or urgent movement, arriving instead as a subtle shift in posture, in tone, in expectation. The doctor stood near the bed, not in a circle, not in discussion, but in stillness, reviewing information they already knew by heart, glancing at monitors that no longer offered new answers, their expressions composed, yet unmistakably resigned, as if each of them were privately acknowledging the same truth at the same time. Every protocol had been followed. Every available option had been considered. Medications had been adjusted carefully, then discontinued when they no longer produced effect. Interventions had been attempted with precision and restraint, always balancing hope with realism, until finally there was nothing left to escalate, nothing left to introduce that would meaningfully change the trajectory. The body was no longer responding in ways medicine could influence. This was not failure, at least not in the sense that implies error or neglect, but rather the quiet acknowledgement of a boundary, the invisible line where knowledge ends and uncertainty begins, where even the most advanced tools must step back and admit their limits. One physician spoke gently, choosing words that carried clarity without cruelty, explaining that they would continue to provide support, to maintain comfort, to observe, but that recovery was no longer something they could reasonably expect, and that whatever happened next would unfold beyond their control. The family listened without interruption, nodding slowly, absorbing sentences that felt unreal even as they were spoken aloud, aware that they were hearing something final, something that could not be undone or revised. In that moment, hope did not disappear completely, but it changed form, slipping away from charts and data and settling into something quieter, something that could no longer be defended or explained, something that simply existed because letting go felt impossible. Medicine had reached its edge, and beyond that edge, there was only waiting. Nothing announced itself. There was no sudden sound, no alarm, no dramatic movement in the room that would signal a turning point, because whatever began to happen did so quietly, almost cautiously, as if it were unsure whether it was allowed to interrupt the stillness that had already settled there. For several minutes, no one noticed anything at all. The machines continued their steady rhythm, the same sounds they had made for hours, the same lights blinking with mechanical consistency, offering no obvious indication that anything had changed, until one nurse, standing close to the monitor out of habit rather than expectation, felt an unease she could not immediately name. She leaned in slightly, narrowing her eyes, not searching for hope, only verifying what she thought she might be seeing. The numbers were different. Not dramatically so, not enough to provoke excitement, but different in a way that did not fit the pattern that had been unfolding throughout the night. Subtle enough to be dismissed, yet persistent enough to demand attention? She checked the leads, adjusted the sensors, repeated the measurement, assuming error before allowing possibility. But the readings remained unchanged, quietly contradicting everything they had been told to expect. Another nurse stepped closer, then a doctor. They did not speak at first, each of them watching, waiting, allowing time to pass, because time itself had become the only reliable witness. And it was in that passing that the change continued, not rushing, not reversing course, but slowly, unmistakably stabilizing. Breathing patterns shifted, still assisted, yet less strained, less erratic, as if the body had found a rhythm it had forgotten how to hold. And with each passing minute, the sense of finality that had filled the room earlier began to loosen its grip, replaced not by certainty, but by confusion. No one said the word miracle. No one needed to. They simply stayed, attentive and silent, as something beyond expectation unfolded in front of them, not as a moment of spectacle, but as a quiet refusal to end when everything said it should. Confusion arrived before hope, settling into the room like a cautious presence, because no one there had been prepared for reversal, and trained minds do not shift easily once they have accepted an outcome as final. The doctors did not rush to conclusions. They rechecked the monitors, reviewed the readings, adjusted settings not to provoke change, but to ensure accuracy, moving with the same careful restraint that had guided them throughout the night, aware that false optimism could be as dangerous as despair. The improvement did not vanish. Minutes passed, then more, and what had first appeared as an anomaly began to hold its ground, steady enough to resist dismissal, gentle enough to defy explanation, leaving the room suspended in a state where certainty had not returned, but inevitability had quietly retreated. A nurse stood very still near the bed, her hands folded loosely in front of her, blinking more often than usual, as if grounding herself in the moment, while another reached instinctively for the patient's hand, pausing only briefly before resting her fingers there, not as a medical intervention, but as something purely human. The family noticed the change not through numbers or charts, but through posture, through the way the room itself seemed to breathe differently, the way voices softened rather than closed, the way no one suggested stepping away anymore. The man near the foot of the bed loosened his grip, unaware that he had been holding his breath for hours, while the woman by the wall slowly leaned forward in her chair, her gaze fixed now not on the floor, but on the patient's face, searching for signs she had already been told not to expect. No one celebrated. No one spoke of outcomes. They simply remained there together, bound by uncertainty that no longer felt empty, but alive with possibility, even if no one yet knew what that possibility would become. Recovery did not arrive as a single moment, nor did it unfold with the clarity of a conclusion, because what happened in that room that night was not an ending but a reopening, a gradual return to possibility that required patience, vigilance, and an acceptance that progress would come slowly, if it came at all. The days that followed were careful ones, marked by observation rather than celebration, by cautious optimism restrained by experience, as doctors monitored the patient closely, adjusting support, watching for setbacks they knew were still possible, never assuming that what had changed would necessarily remain. There were moments of uncertainty, moments when progress seemed to stall, moments when fear returned quietly and without warning, reminding everyone involved how fragile the situation still was. Yet with each passing day, the patient continued to hold on, responding, stabilizing, reclaiming small functions that had seemed unreachable just hours before. Eventually, the machines were adjusted, then reduced, one by one, not as a declaration of triumph, but as a careful acknowledgement that the body was once again participating in its own survival, no longer entirely dependent on what surrounded it. The doctors documented everything. They reviewed the case together, discussing timelines, variables, interventions, searching for explanations that fit within their understanding. And while some elements could be named and measured, others resisted clarity, leaving gaps that could not be easily filled, spaces where language faltered and certainty could not follow. The family, however, did not focus on the charts. They remembered the stillness. They remembered the moment when hope had quietly ended, when words had failed, when the future had narrowed to a single point of waiting. And they remembered just as clearly the moment when that narrowing stopped, when something unaccounted for entered the room and altered the direction of everything that followed. Life did not return to what it had been before. It rarely does. But it continued, reshaped by an awareness that remained long after the hospital lights faded. An awareness that some moments cannot be explained fully, only carried forward, held gently, and honored through the way one chooses to live afterward. There are moments in life that do not announce their importance while they are happening, moments that pass quietly, almost unnoticed, because they do not arrive with certainty or explanation, but with questions that linger long after the moment itself has faded. And the night in that hospital room became one of those moments for everyone who stood there. Long after the machines were turned off, long after the lights dimmed and the patient was moved out of intensive care, what remained was not a clear answer, not a formula that could be repeated or analyzed, but a memory shaped by silence, by waiting, and by the unmistakable sense that something had entered the space where nothing else was supposed to be. The doctors returned to their routines, carrying the weight of responsibility and knowledge that defines their work. Yet some of them would later admit, quietly and without drama, that this case stayed with them longer than most, not because it defied science, but because it reminded them of its boundaries, of the fragile line where certainty gives way to humility. The family, too, was changed, though not in ways that could be measured or explained easily, because when you stand in a room where hope is ended, and then watch it return without permission, you do not leave unchanged, no matter how much time passes or how normal life becomes again. They spoke differently afterward, with more pauses, more patience, more awareness of how easily everything can shift, how quickly the ordinary can dissolve into crisis, and how little control any of us truly holds over the moments that define our lives. Faith, if it appeared at all, did not arrive as a declaration or a sudden transformation, but as something quieter and more enduring, a presence that did not demand certainty, only openness, not asking to be proven, only to be acknowledged. Because perhaps the most unsettling part of that night was not that the doctors had given up, but that when they did, when everything humanly possible had been exhausted, the story did not end where it was supposed to. Perhaps that is what makes moments like this difficult to speak about openly, because they resist classification, living uncomfortably between explanation and mystery, belonging fully to neither, asking us to accept that not everything meaningful can be named or understood. The miracle, if it can be called that, was not loud. It did not arrive with spectacle or certainty. It arrived quietly, almost apologetically, as if aware that it did not fit into the order of things, and yet it stayed, altering the course of a life, and with it, the lives of everyone who stood witness. And maybe the lasting impact of that night was not simply survival, not simply recovery, but the way it gently dismantled assumptions, reminding those present that there are moments when silence is not absence, when waiting is not emptiness, and when the end of effort is not always the end of the story. Some questions remained unanswered, and perhaps they always would, because not every experience is meant to be resolved. Some are meant only to be carried, held with care, allowed to shape the way we see the world, without demanding that the world explain itself in return. And so the night passed, as all nights do, leaving behind no proof that could be displayed, no certainty that could be defended, only the quiet knowledge that something had happened there, something that could not be undone, something that continued to echo long after the room returned to normal. And maybe that is where the true change occurred, not in the machines, not in the charts, not even in the body that recovered, but in the understanding that sometimes, when everything human has finished speaking, something else remains, waiting patiently to be noticed.